European Parliament.
Well, a question there in the chamber of the European Parliament. It was just put, wasn't it? How quickly should the UK leave the EU? In whose gift actually is it? European leaders have said there will be no negotiations on an exit deal until the UK formally asks to leave, or at least some have. Would it be better to wait a while, let the economic dust settle after the vote to leave, or is it more painless in some respects for both sides to try and get over this as quickly as possible and invoke Article 50 with all possible haste? Joining us to talk about this, Sam Bowman, Executive Director at the Adam Smith Institute, Free Market Campaigning Organisation, and Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent, that is Matthew Goodwin. Gentlemen, a very good morning to both of you. Professor Goodwin, I can start with you. There we saw it in the the European Parliament in Brussels. You had Jean-Claude Juncker, President of the Commission, and Nigel Farage agreeing that Article 50 ought to be invoked as quickly as possible.
Well, absolutely. Quite remarkable scenes in the European Parliament. Martin Schulz even warning other MEPs that they were acting like UKIP while they were heckling Nigel Farage. So quite a remarkable day in European politics. I think Farage and Juncker are pointing at the same ideal, if you like, which is to get this negotiation moving as quickly as possible. But they are coming from different points of view. Juncker wants to do this. He's worried about primarily economic reasons, about instability in the Eurozone, and Farage really wants to get this thing moving because I think he's concerned about what he's seeing within conservative Eurosceptic camps, particularly in terms of their statements around migration, and now, for example, people like Jeremy Hunt saying there might be a second referendum and so on. So I think Farage essentially wants to get this locked down.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Looking at this from totally different directions, as Matthew was saying there. Nigel Farage presumably wants to invoke Article 50 as quickly as possible, lest he witnesses a bit of backsliding.
Well, that's true, but I'm not sure either of them really have the best interests of the UK at heart. The real emergency here is to get a plan on the table. What markets really need to see is that there's somebody in charge and that they have a plan about how to make this the softest exit possible. What we're really, really worried about right now is that the Faragists will get their way and that the only thing that people will think about is freedom of movement, no matter how expensive it is for us. Now, that doesn't have to be the way we do it. Really, what we should be looking for, I think, is a soft transitionary period of, say, 5 to 10 years, where we remain in the European Economic Area, in the single market, leave the European Union, perhaps slightly modify freedom of movement, and use that time to agree a truly British deal, where we have lots and as much access to the single market as possible, but we do bring in those restrictions to freedom of movement that many people want.
We've just separated you, actually, by Jean-Claude Juncker. Neither of you can see it, but the live session is still going on in Parliament. You can see Nigel Farage looking a bit lugubrious in the front row. He's had his 2 penneth already, as you've heard this morning. Matthew Goodwin, in whose gift is it, ultimately, to invoke Article 50? I mean, the received wisdom that it requires the Prime Minister to write a letter to the European Commission saying, we want to invoke Article 50. There are others who say the language is a bit woolly, and actually if the other remaining 27 nations say, actually, you know what, we're going to invoke Article 50 on your behalf, that they can do that. So who gets to press the big red button?
Well, I mean, in theory, this would ordinarily be going from the government. They'd be triggering Article 50. The problem at the present time, obviously, is we essentially have no government because we have no effective Prime Minister in that David Cameron has resigned. So there's a lot of confusion and instability. But just briefly, the point that Sam made there about Farage having their clear about what's just happened in British politics. People have voted for Brexit because they want fundamental reform on immigration and free movement. This is principally what is behind the vote. So any negotiation now that goes forward under a new Conservative leader, after a possible new general election, has to put immigration reform front and centre. And an EEA-type deal, even in the short term, or even possibly over the longer term, will not deal with that concern among voters.
Can we just talk a little bit about process? We just saw Jean-Claude Juncker again on his feet in the chamber, and he was saying he didn't want to see any deals made in smoke-filled rooms by perhaps bilateral arrangements, Britain coming across to Brussels or other European capitals and making these little backroom deals. That's going to happen, though, isn't it, before Article 50 is invoked?
Well, of course, any negotiation is going to have to take place in rooms with politicians. You know, it's a very Farage thing to say, oh, we don't want any deals to take place. But The problem here isn't just, I mean, we can't just look at freedom of movement. If ending freedom of movement means a deep recession, that's a betrayal of people who voted for Leave and for Remain. We have to weigh up lots of different considerations, and the economy and jobs and the strength of the pound are all very, very important to everybody who voted Remain and Leave. We live in a liberal democracy. A majority of Leavers may have voted because they were motivated by immigration concerns, but that still leaves 48% of the population and many Leavers who were concerned about things other than immigration. And to simply say that that's the only thing that matters, and it doesn't matter if we get a huge recession as long as we curb freedom of movement, I think really, really reduces this to a very dangerously simple way of looking at it. We need to get a deal that makes Britain prosperous. Yes, we need to reform freedom of movement. There are things that we can do both domestically of the deal we get that will curb freedom of movement and address people's concerns. But we cannot act as if freedom of movement doesn't have any other implications. If we lose access to the single market, then we really will see a deep recession, and that is a betrayal of people who voted Leave as well.
Matthew Goodwin, I'm just trying to keep this slightly focused on the timetabling of this and the speed with which Article 50 can be invoked, because there are many other topics we could talk about, but just a specific point. Let's reflect upon the fact that David Cameron told us that he would be in Brussels today and he would invoke Article 50. That was what he warned. And then, of course, come Friday morning, he said, actually, no, there'll be a delay.
Yeah, well, essentially, this is rooted in, the changing of the guard, and it's clear that Cameron and Osborne have essentially said, over to you guys,
no, but it was a broken promise, Matthew, wasn't it? That was a broken promise.
Well, there was a suggestion that Article 50 would be triggered much sooner than it currently looks like it will be, but David Cameron at the moment doesn't need to worry about broken promises because he's on his way out. But he is essentially saying, over to you guys, over to Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and Daniel Hannan, you guys figure it out. I don't want my legacy essentially being tarnished with this. They then have to go through, you talk about the timeline. I mean, this is a complex timeline because we now go straight into a Conservative Party leadership election, which will not culminate until the Conservative Party conference. We then may, if you believe reports over recent days, and say Boris Johnson is elected, we may then go straight into a general election campaign, which means that candidate will have to campaign on the offer, on the deal, on the desired outcome of that negotiation. So that means we won't get to a culmination until the end of the year, possibly early 2017. So how will the markets respond to that?
Sam Bowman, we're just looking again from those live pictures from Brussels. We're looking at the Martin Schulz right now, but Jean-Claude Juncker was just on his feet.